Neon Green Network begrüßt den Designkritiker John Thackara.
So Adam asked us all to begin with a short statement about where do we come from and why are we standing here today. I personally am somewhat perplexed, but I've done my best to put together a very short introduction, actually to the last 4.5 billion years, as I'll explain in a moment, because I think I'm really here to try, as a storyteller and as a bringer of interesting news, to put things into a different perspective, which can perhaps release the pressure that we so often feel in these kind of events. So a brief note about the new story and the new time frame for that. Secondly, some short comments about signals of transformation, the evidence that I have as a writer and as a collector of news about things which individually may seem small, but taken together, I think, are part of the profound transformation that so many people have been asking about and calling for. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about in what ways can we be confident about when all these small events and activities added up together, do they genuinely have the possibility to add up something bigger than the parts? And can we do anything proactively in a mindful way, in a designerly way, to help accelerate the growth of this alternative as it emerges? But I promised you a kind of quick summary of the last 4.5 billion years. I love this picture because it basically puts the kind of efforts of human beings into perspective, the various names given by scientists and researchers to a very long history, beginning with what allegedly was a bowl of lifeless rock and steadily different phases of the emergence of life on Earth. And tottering on the top of that pile is the history of humanity's 200,000 years presence on the planet. As you can see, even there, a relatively small part of the bigger picture. And it's been given the name the Anthropocene to describe the period of geological time when human beings touched and influenced everything about us on the planet. Some people think this is only just and right, and this is man on top, and this is where he should be. Others regard the Anthropocene as a definition of bad news, but we can discuss that aspect. I have in one picture a summary of what has happened in the 10,000 years since man got on top of that pile. And it kind of, to me, is the backstory that we insufficiently think about when we're looking at all the kind of short-term stresses and strains in this discussion. So on the left is a hunter-gatherer, roughly 10,000 years ago, who, to keep body and soul together, needed some heat, not much clothing, as you can see, maybe some shelter. In round numbers, 5,000 kilocalories of resources and energy per day. On the right is a modern hipster type of person climbing up the Shard in London 2 years ago, who, as you can see, behind him is the infrastructure, the tools, the equipment, the cities, the civilization without which we apparently could not survive. Those are what are often described by politicians as needs that explain how we're supposed to retrofit our economy in a kind of radical way. 60 times more energy per body between then and now. That is the history of development in the kind of Anthropocene age, which you might consider to be a rash or possibly misguided way of making progress in the context of living on a finite planet. But it's curious how much we manage to blind ourselves or simply ignore that when discussing these other questions that we're here tonight to talk about. For many years, when I started to look at this question of limits in relation to an economy that had to expand in order to survive, I was quite a confirmed doomer. I was one of those people who said, it's all going to come crashing down, we're facing a disaster, and I basically spent my time trying to decide which pickup truck to buy, what kind of guns and peanut butter to put in it, and which mountain I was going to drive to make my escape with the other survivalists. In other words, I had a plan to get the hell out of the Anthropocene, excuse my French, rather than wait around for the kind of consequences to catch up with me. But I did travel, but not out of the modern world totally. I did, however, start to look around more proactively for examples of alternatives. And over the years, what I began to find in many, many different places around the world is the element of a definitely profound new story. A new story different from the notion that we exist on the planet to serve the economy. A new story than the one that says the object of our life on Earth is to grow GDP. A new story in terms of what is valuable in our lives and how do we order priorities between one kind of priority and the other. And that new story was in outline, little hints of it. It wasn't written down in books, it doesn't exist in manifestos, but it came from people that I meet and you must have met on the edge of the normal kind of civilized or organized world who were out there looking for ways to do things differently. And so one aspect of this new story, which is totally surprising to me, is the openness of such different people to looking at this longer time frame. So there are two friends of mine just 2 days ago on Dartmoor in the southwest of England on what is called a deep time walk, which is a geologist in this case and an environmental historian who help us to read the landscape and understand that what you or me might regard as a beautiful but rather static view is actually part of a constantly changing story. And one of the amazing things I discovered on that particular walk was that Totnes, where I was located for this walk, in the few billion years ago, roughly halfway down the time chart on the left, was actually on the equator, which is one of the many strange things. The point being that the planet as a living system is not a lump of dead rock. Therefore, once we get that into our minds, then all the things that follow in terms of what we should be doing relative to the other living systems starts to take a different priority. And in case you think that I'm involved in some sort of pagan sentimental retreat back into the Stone Age, there is even an app from Schumacher College being developed called the Deep Time Walk, in which one can share the experience of looking at the landscape, at rocks, at geological formations in different ways. And it's one of the many examples for those who are nervous that technology has become the devil in this story. Digital drives live is what they say in the music business. I think in the way that we reconnect the planet, it's also true for that. So there was one aspect of this new story, regular people saying maybe we should take a longer time frame in thinking about what our priorities are and to whom we owe our obligations and our loyalties. That story is manifest in lots of different ways in the work that I do. So I travel a lot looking for basically small grassroots projects emerging from the edges of the normal world. And I would say 90% of the people I talk to say, yes, there are interesting things happen, but they're not in the media, they're not in our education system, they escape the attention of policymakers and researchers. So you have this huge cloud of activity which in some curious way is real but invisible at the same time, which is one of the ways why the environmental question is so stressful, and why also we end up talking most of the time about the bad things that are going wrong. In my work, I collect very day-to-day examples of how people are meeting daily life needs, such as growing food, feeding their children, moving from one place to another, shelter, clothing, the usual stuff. 90% of the people that I meet and talk about do not consider themselves to be activists or social innovators or pioneers at all. They're just trying to meet needs under growingly tough circumstances in new ways, which, by coincidence or by trend, are socially just and environmentally less damaging than the mainstream ones that we're dealing with. And their book is about two things. One, to celebrate the existence of these projects, thousands, tens of thousands. My friend Paul Hawkin reckons there are probably at least 1 million grassroots projects in the so-called developed countries, never mind the way that the global south is creative every day in terms of meeting those daily life needs. But the other one is to pose the question, as I said at the beginning, in what way can we be confident that this explosion of small experimental projects are the elements of an alternative global system? And that is the big question that I always get answered. Yes, it's nice to have stories about people growing tomatoes on their balcony, but does that seriously change the global system? So I could tell you about lots of those stories, but I decided to focus on one because I owe a special debt of loyalty to Austria for a moment of epiphany about 4 years ago, and it concerned this sandwich, which was at a monastery or kind of convent in Werberg, where I had, I think, possibly the most beautiful sandwich I've eaten in my life. on bread grown in the premises by the nuns, their own cows, their own cow, their own grain, their own milling equipment, and so on. And as I held and just enjoyed that sandwich, I began to understand for the first time how very small things can connect people in terms of joy, but also creativity and awareness with the bigger things which are so abstract and hard to connect with. So, over the years that followed that Wehrberg epiphany, I've been rather obsessed and possibly unhealthily by bread, so that's one of my beautiful breads from Latvia that people give me. In India, I go to India a lot, they have hundreds, thousands of bread traditions. London, very fast-growing craft bakers, small-scale bakers. This is the gorgeous bread that they made for me when I launched the book in New York. Some friends of mine who are part of this kind of networked bread movement, back to the kind of small-scale, mixture thing, the sourdough. In Slovenia, very hot bread movement. Handsome young guys, if you're interested, who make very kind of interesting lectures about their work, doing the flour and the bread making. Lapland, incredibly dynamic bread scene. So what I want you to notice is not the technical details, but how happy all these people are dealing with bread. This is a very well-known thing, right? Bread people and beer people are, in general, very cheerful and don't think much about the end of civilization or the environmental crisis. And I think it is because they are dealing in their bodies and in their social lives with living things, living bread, living beer, the soils, and so on. It got a bit confusing when I went to Sicily, and there was a new media festival in a rather small town. They were doing something to do with sampling the noise by bread as it matures, and I never did understand it, but just to show that it's not just about foodies, the new media crowd are also involved in bread. But then I started to think, in doing the book and in remembering this sandwich, which I've never forgotten, as you can tell, it connects us to these abstract questions like, firstly, the evolution of the land, because the sandwich and food generally comes from the land. We've forgotten that connection. We have lectures about also very abstract sides of it, but in going for a walk and eating a sandwich, you say, where did the bread come from? It's a meaningful, practical, daily connection. The bread story connects with this whole soil thing, which we've been given tremendous kind of alarming stories about over the last few years. Without soil, we'll all be finished. Only 100 harvests left in the British agricultural system. Dozens and dozens of horrific stories about soil, but still very abstract in the abstract or watched on television. But if you have a sandwich on one side and you're in a field on the other, you suddenly see, yes, these two subjects are connected and they're extremely important. This was a group of my partners on an island in Sweden called Grinder, if anybody's been to it. I said, okay, bread is great, but what about the seeds and the taste of plants generally? Can you, as a kind of very urban crowd of architects and urbanists and those sorts of people, can you find a way to bring this subject to life? And they made a soil tasting festival, which was beautiful. And this was people who'd never thought about it in their lives except for 3 days earlier, proving at that moment to me that this connection between living food and living soils and so on is something we have all inside us, and it's just a little door waiting to be pushed open. It's not some gigantic hill that we have to climb up. Through that bread and through discovering the soil for the first time, I'm totally not an expert, I discovered the absolute miracles of nature's internet, the rhizome that suffuses the whole planet, connecting plants to each other in ways that are extraordinary and mind-blowing, but again, we don't think about it or know about it, we just kind of operate in our media, educational and cultural bubble. That by itself made the sandwich a revolutionary experience. And then in particular, what I began to do with that sandwich was to understand things like food systems, which had been very perplexing to me for many years. So I'd been told by all sorts of experts and people with thick glasses and carrying thick books and with many degrees from many universities that the food system is the primary cause of our troubles. And I thought, well, what is a food system? What does it look like? What do you do with it? And if it's so bad, how do we fix it? And for years, I was completely blocked, and most people I met said, what is a food system? My friends in California made this beautiful picture of a global food system. This is Nourish, which has everything, farming, politics, social, biological, economy. it's a fantastic piece of graphic creativity, but again, it's not terribly obvious what you're supposed to do with it except hanging it on your wall and admire it. What I learned, though, going back to those kind of real-world experiences, that if you zoom into the food system, you start to see recognizable things going on which perhaps you can be active on, subsystems like waters going in and out of a city, how a city gets its food, and so on. But still, they're kind of just squirrely things on a map. They're not something that regular civilians and normal people can connect with. It begins to be helpful. Then you go in a bit further, and a food system which moves from being very abstract, you start to see these dots appear, which are individual people and activities and places connected to each other. And that's when you see, oh, there's a cook there, there's a restaurant, there's a garden, there's a farm, there's a kind of warehouse. The elements of a food system start to become clear. And then a magical thing happens. You go one step further and you find real people doing real things, which also, by the way, they don't think about food systems, but they are active members of it. This is somebody I met just last week who's one of the many hundreds of people who says, why can't we have food grown here to eat here? And she has a thing called the Oat Project, which involves farmers, fields, learning about growing, learning about milling, raising money for machines, bringing together 10, 20, 30 partners in a kind of oat ecosystem. The point being, she started off from knowing zero about food systems, not a scientist, not a policymaker, but saying, I want good oats, and I am going to do the work necessary to make it happen. And she's now into year 3 of an absolutely wonderful project about oats for that region, which is being reproduced all over the place. Fantastic stories. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, my sandwich enabled me as a storyteller and a seeker after some sort of understanding to collect very abstract things like the food system, to discussions about heritage grains on the top right, that loaf of bread that they made for me in New York, and the grain in Holly's hand on the top. This multiple difference of scales suddenly began to make sense and was connected to each other. So all over the world, you are people like Holly Tiffin doing oat projects, not thinking of themselves as radicals or environmental saints, but as saying, I want local oats. What do I have to do to get local oats? But it raises the question, okay, supposing you have 1,000, 10,000, 1 million Holly Tiffins, is that seriously enough to represent an alternative to the global system? And it's a relative question which I consider myself to be part of that unpleasant possibility that it's not enough. This is an Amazon warehouse, and somewhere in there is my book, which you can see, which is one of a few other books that are published every day. And so as a writer, my contribution to this whole picture is to kind of write books about stuff or articles. You might regard me as crazy to even contemplate doing it, in the same way that one Holly Tiffin growing oats in one place is crazily optimistic. It's a reasonable question. My proposition is that the alternative that we are moving towards is a global mosaic of local living economies that have a certain coherence within a larger framework, but that it's probably true that just letting things grow like seeds in the ground is not enough. It's part of it, but we need one more step. The first step is to say that we don't need to give each other lectures about how bad we are, or even, for that matter, how good we are. Just to say, in all our efforts, make a simple choice. Does our proposed activity, yes or no, leave the soils healthier, the water healthier, and our bodies healthier? That's a simple way to reorder our sense of priorities in our culture and in our society. So value is care for health, not value is GDP or value is not numbers. There are some details to be implemented on that, but I regard that as a very simple new theory of value. I hope you like it. The story of place provides a kind of location and rootedness for that story. So not all the care in the world, but the care for our place, as I'll come on to in a minute. The stories that we tell, and therefore the actions we take, should connect things that have been separated for so long. The city and the country obviously are separated, but that includes, I think, the subject of people whose voices are not heard because they're not here. And the charge that metropolitan elites are too self-satisfied and go on television and tell everybody that things are fine when they are not. If you want an explanation of why the politics is so damaging and dangerous at the moment, this absurd suggestion that things will be fine when they won't. It must be part of it. And think back to what I said at the beginning about the kind of fundamental illogic of imagining you can run a globally expanding economy on a finite planet. People know that. We all know that, including ignorant people who have violent political reactions. We have to find a way to reach them and have that conversation with them and not just regard them as ignorant and ill-informed. We have to be in this conversation together. So when I talk about urban and rural reconnecting, that's part of it. The social and the economic and the ecological, in other words, coming together in a single story, and not just storytelling, but storytelling that shapes the actions that we take. And this is where you get into the area of mapping things, the community action, so the designers in the room, you're familiar with this type of activity. Put all the good things on the table, look for connections that can be made that are missing, see if there are promising places or people or activities that could be helped to expand on a one-by-one basis. But as you can see from that, it is a bit complicated. Is there some way in which we can accelerate the process? And this, to conclude, is where I introduce the notion of platforms to help all this radical collaboration accelerate. This is my favorite platform of the moment. It's a French project about finding ways to connect people who need food with farmers. It's called La Ruche qui dit oui. It's basically a website which connects hungry people with farmers, and I can't go into the details. All you need to know is that this was started by two people, a chef called Guillaume Chéron and a friend who was a web developer who said, surely we can do better. And 4 years after it was launched, there are nearly 500 of those ruches in France and in many other countries as well now. That begins to transform the food system and the distribution system in ways that our kind of exhortation and advocacy and screaming about food does not. It's a kind of intervention into the system which transforms the availability of stuff. My favorite revolutionary platform is from Israel, La Zooz. It's a kind of second or third generation after Uber in terms of how do we share resources in such a way that we use less space, less vehicles, but that the system is owned by the community. They use the fair share mechanism and encryption and blockchain, very, very kind of bleeding edge technology in order to enable a commons-based platform to flourish. So if you want to know how to get around the problem of things like Uber that seem to go bad when they were good, this is the kind of place where young guys in obscure places are inventing those replacements. I saw this this morning, brilliant product pitch. The Coffee Grounds to Mushrooms platform. You can look it up on the internet, but basically it's about collecting coffee grounds and using them to grow mushrooms in. You may have heard of it. Two Austrian entrepreneurs making it happen, connecting all the bits together that were otherwise separated. Food waste platforms, they're all over the place. Service platforms for urban farming. These are just examples of where the bits of a picture, such as a farmer, a field, a person, a family, are connected together in a mindful act, and the organization is enabled by the platform to be as easy as possible. This is Fibershed in California, a fabulous example of how do you stop the sheep of 2 million, the coats of 2 million sheep being exported to China? Answer, connect all the bits together in a network by designing connections between them. I'm going to stop there. You can relook up Fibershed. It's just a glorious story about all the different activities that can be brought together. And if it's for fiber, it's true for water, for leather, for clothes, for shelter. Platforms to connect the bits that are separated in the way that we organize things now. And to conclude, doing so in a geographical way that has meaning to a wide variety of people. So I think that it's not just enough to be practical. We need something that excites us, that generates cultural energy, social ambition, political novelty. And as far as I'm concerned, the notion of a bioregion is, in a reality, much more than nation states. So although the kind of stress of this moment causes people to say we need a Europe of the fatherlands, fatherlands for the most part are invented political concepts made in a relatively recent time, and they are not connected to the earth, to the soils, to the rivers, and to the watershed. So my modest proposal to conclude is a Europe of bioregions in which all these different activities that I've been talking about make sense to people who disagree on lots of other things because it is their place, and their place is real, it's based in the land, and that's what turns us on. That's why I'm optimistic, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thackara. I can tell you your little bread, your Austrian sandwich you featured before has a social media star potential now.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's on Twitter now.
I
so
totally recommend
no one
Sister
knows.
Maria. She's the best sandwich maker in Austria.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing this with us tonight. What I like to know is what's the vision? You know, what's the end game here? What would the world look like if, you know, all those grassroots organizations, all those small activist communities took over? Are they supposed to tackle capitalism as we are living it now?
I think capitalism is tackling itself by committing itself to perpetual growth in a world that cannot grow perpetually. So capitalism is reaching its end game. It's a very painful and damaging for all of us. But I'm not proposing to try and answer capitalism problem. I think we have to look at all these examples of different ways of meeting rather simple needs. But the interesting creative activity is to connect them to each other so that they become stronger and more interesting, and that you connect the place side to the practical side and the social side. And basically, it's not my job to do it. It's all happening. My basic proposition is that the alternative is happening now. We don't have to kind of dream about it or wish for it. Go and find it, make it better, connect it to each other, and celebrate the fact that things aren't as bad as we think they are if we look only at one particular telescope.
Very inspiring. Thank you so much. Und wenn wir, ja, bitteschön, ein paar haben wir jetzt angesetzt. Ja.